We just got the word from our reporters out there at the airport that Lyndon B. Johnson has been sworn in as the President of the United States.
Lyndon Johnson assumes the presidency and escalates America's involvement in Vietnam. A major attack by the North ends in military defeat, but the American press helps turn it into a political victory.
The Tet Offensive was tremendously important because it was portrayed as showing the communists were winning. I blame the press for a major part of our loss in Vietnam.
Hello again. As we saw in our last episode, John F. Kennedy was a staunch anti-communist who believed South Vietnam's war with the North was a crucial battle in the global Cold War. When Kennedy's life was cut short by an assassin's bullet, a very different man ascended to the Oval Office. Lyndon Baines Johnson wanted as little to do with Vietnam as possible. But the war would come to define his legacy and his presidency, which began as the nation was still in shock over the loss of his young predecessor. Lyndon Baines Johnson became America's 36th president on November 22, 1963, following the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Johnson was a Texan who had excelled in the Senate, where he had been Democratic Majority Leader. He took office determined to advance the ambitious domestic agenda he later called the Great Society. As he started his presidency, the war in Vietnam was of little interest to him. He told one advisor at the time, "I've got bigger things to do right here at home."
LBJ viewed Vietnam as a horrible distraction to his desire to go down in history as the next Franklin Roosevelt, with his Great Society and all of his programs, which he thought were going to keep the Democrats in power forever. And he didn't want to do anything in Vietnam he didn't have to do other than not lose the war.
The new president inherited his predecessor's foreign policy team, which he kept largely intact. Robert McNamara continued as Secretary of Defense, while Dean Rusk remained at the helm of the State Department.
Lyndon Johnson was very different than Kennedy in that he was an old-school politician. He believed in imposing his will by force, whether psychologically or, in case of an overseas venture, doing whatever was necessary. I think there was great confidence or overconfidence that it was going to be easy. But we should learn from Korea. These things are not easy.
Facing an election just 11 months after taking office, Johnson was critically aware that whatever path he chose in Vietnam, be it escalation, inaction, or deeper commitment, would be open to criticism from his political rivals. He resolved to do as little as possible, at least until after Election Day. At a 1963 White House Christmas reception, Johnson reportedly told his military advisors, "Just get me elected, and then you can have your war."
He knew Republicans had accused the Democrats of getting us into World War I and World War II, and in getting us in and then almost losing Korea. And he said, the party cannot afford that, so we cannot let the communists take over. But he said, beyond that, I don't want to get in a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. I don't want to go to war with China. And he did not understand military matters at all.
The fighting in South Vietnam continues. Although military targets in North Vietnam are heavily hit, the numbers of infiltrated North Vietnamese soldiers into the South steadily increases.
The crisis in Southeast Asia could not be ignored. Johnson and his advisors had hoped that the fall of President Diem would calm the country. But the coup against the Vietnamese leader and his subsequent murder had the exact opposite effect. And as the generals in Saigon wrestled among themselves to form a new government, Hanoi was emboldened. In a secret resolution in December of 1963, the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Vietnam declared their intention to defeat the South before more U.S. troops could be committed. A strategy was laid out to consciously gain the sympathy of anti-war groups in the United States. Supplies to the southern guerrillas, dubbed the Viet Cong, were redoubled, and North Vietnamese troops were sent south down the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
The Viet Cong terrorizes the countryside continually with savage hit-and-run tactics.
The GOP seized on Vietnam as proof of Johnson's weakness.
I'm Raymond Massey, and this is what really gets me. This is a picture of a dead American soldier shot by the Viet Cong guerrilla in Vietnam. What's our government doing about it? And the 275 other dead Americans? Nothing, not a thing, because we are fighting a no-win war in Vietnam, a war we don't want to win. Well, as an American, I don't like it. I don't like our policy, and I don't like no-win wars, especially wars our men are getting butchered in. Don't you want to stop this war? Don't you care about what's happening over there? Well, I care a lot.
While he worried that inaction would be perceived as weakness, President Johnson feared that escalation in Vietnam would lead to a direct confrontation with China. Concern he shared with National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy in the spring of 1964.
I'll tell you, the more I just stayed awake last night thinking about this thing, the more I think of it, I don't know what in the hell. It looks like me, we're getting into another Korea. It just worries the hell out of me. I don't see what we can ever hope to get out of there with once we're committed. I believe the Chinese communists coming into it. I don't think that we can fight them 10,000 miles away from home and ever get anywhere in that area. I don't think it's worth fighting for, and I don't think we can get out. And it's just the biggest damn mess.
It is. It's an awful mess.
Lyndon Johnson, looking at the experience in the Korean War, was afraid that if the United States escalated, like moved over the DMZ, went north, like we did in Korea, that the same thing would happen, that China would then move south, move into North Vietnam. So this is why the United States throughout the war never escalated to that point, never moved north.
With hindsight, we know, in fact, the Chinese had no intention of going into North Vietnam. Mao specifically said that we took horrific losses in Korea and we don't want to go through that again. And the North Vietnamese eventually pick up on this and they start complaining that the Chinese are essentially wanting to fight the war to the last North Vietnamese. Clearly, you could have taken Hanoi and Haiphong and the other cities. Now, this has a lot of adverse strategic consequences because essentially U.S. and South Vietnam are always playing defense. They're not able to go on offense, which means the enemy can keep the war up indefinitely.
Well, there apparently have been at least 9 torpedoes in the water, all missed, and apparently 2 of the boats have been sunk.
In August of 1964, American destroyers patrolling the Gulf of Tonkin were assailed by North Vietnamese patrol boats. The next night, Captain John J. Herrick of the USS Maddox reported that his ship was under a second attack. With the presidential election just 3 months away, Johnson reached out to his Republican opponent, Barry Goldwater, before announcing his plans for retaliation.
Well, we are just very confidentially, we're going to take all the boats out that we can and all the bases from which they come.
Well, I think it's proper action, and I think you've taken the right step. I'm sure that you'll find everybody will be behind you.
I thank you, and I wanted you to know about it, and we had a good meeting here, and I didn't want to say anything until I was able to reach you.
Well, that's all right, and like always, Americans will stick together.
Thank you, Barry.
Okay.
Bye, fella.
There's a lot of confusion about this. It looks like later there may have only been 1 attack, but in either case, Johnson feels compelled to do something. He's actually not chomping at the bit. He wants Vietnam to stay on the back burner and out of sight until the 1964 presidential election, but he doesn't want to appear weak. So he decides they're going to undertake a very small and limited strike.
In retaliation for this unprovoked attack on the high seas, our forces have struck the bases used by the North Vietnamese patrol craft.
The initial U.S. retaliatory strike was limited to 4 North Vietnamese patrol boat bases and a single oil storage depot. 2 U.S. planes were lost in action. Within days, Johnson asked Congress for permission to escalate the war.
I shall immediately request the Congress to pass a resolution making it clear that our government is united in its determination to take all necessary measures in support of freedom and in defense of peace in Southeast Asia.
Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution on August 7th. 416 members of the House and 98 senators voted affirmatively. Only 2 senators voted no. The U.S. airstrikes that followed destroyed 33 North Vietnamese vessels, as well as a major oil storage facility. Navy pilots flew 64 sorties. 2 U.S. planes were shot down. 1 pilot died, becoming the first aviator killed in action in the Vietnam War. Lieutenant Everett Alvarez Jr. became the first American POW. He would spend 8.5 years in captivity, much of it inside what American prisoners called the Hanoi Hilton, North Vietnam's most brutal prisoner of war camp.
The determination of all Americans to carry out our
The airstrikes against the North marked a new chapter in the war. Air power would become a major factor, but LBJ and his advisors introduced a novel strategy when it came to bombing the North, one hinted at in his address to the nation. Rather than threaten certain destruction, Johnson promised moderation. It was a strategy based on a new way of thinking about war, developed by the same sort of theorists McNamara had brought in to help run the Pentagon.
According to these theorists, you can communicate with your adversary through limited shows of force. So if we undertake some show of force, the enemy will understand that we're serious and they will back off. And this was not based on any historical understanding, but it was abstract theorizing of the most sort of academic sort. Now, it turns out this theorizing was deeply flawed, because what happens is the North Vietnamese look at this. They don't conclude that this is some sort of signal they should pay attention to. They conclude this must be weakness, because America is this great power, yet all they did was this little pinprick.
We would have a bombing pause, and you could just see huge numbers of vehicles and ships and everything else suddenly swarm into South Vietnam. Now, of course, you do not want to be bombing civilian populations. You want to be very careful in the collateral damage and be protecting the people of the country, the civilians of the country. But there were huge numbers of strategic targets that were perfectly lawful. McNamara really was not doing the kinds of things we needed to do to win the war.
On the home front, Johnson's reprisals against North Vietnam helped boost him in the polls, countering Republican charges that Johnson was, quote, soft on communism. In contrast, Republican nominee Barry Goldwater ran as a staunch anti-communist who would use all necessary means to defend America. Goldwater told reporters, "I'd drop a low-yield atomic bomb on Chinese supply lines in Vietnam, or maybe shell them with the 7th Fleet." Johnson's presidential campaign effectively portrayed Goldwater as an extremist.
6, 8, 9,
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
These are the stakes to make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
And an overwhelming mandate is handed to Lyndon Baines Johnson, who becomes 36th President of the United States. The man who was thrust into office through the hand of tragedy captures an overwhelming percentage of the popular vote.
It is a mandate for unity.
Less than 2 weeks after taking the oath of office for the second time, LBJ resumed airstrikes against North Vietnam, this time in retaliation for a Viet Cong attack on a U.S. airbase. The battle happened to fall on the final day of a visit by National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy. As he surveyed the damage at Pleiku, the reality of the situation seemed to hit home. Upon his return to Washington, he told Johnson, "The situation in Vietnam is deteriorating, and without new U.S. action, defeat appears inevitable, probably not in a matter of weeks or perhaps even months, but within the next year or so. The international prestige of the United States and a substantial part of our influence are directly at risk in Vietnam." Johnson retaliated with multiple airstrikes on North Vietnam. It was a campaign the Pentagon named Rolling Thunder. The air campaign had several goals: harass the movement of men and material along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, disrupt the North Vietnamese war effort, and force Hanoi to the negotiating table. Strict rules of engagement kept American fighter aircraft from pursuing the enemy, especially along the border with China. Johnson personally selected bombing targets, saying, "American pilots could not hit an outhouse without my permission." But for all the effort in the skies over North Vietnam, little changed on the ground. And there was another problem. Operation Rolling Thunder could not reach the true backbone of the North's war machine. The industrial base of the country lay outside its borders, in China, the Soviet Union, and the Warsaw Pact satellite countries that supplied Vietnam with arms and equipment. Soviet-supplied MiGs were stationed in airfields in southern China, beyond the reach of U.S. bombers. Johnson, nonetheless, hoped negotiations would prove fruitful.
Once the communists know, as we know, that a violent solution is impossible, then a peaceful solution is inevitable.
Every single time that we did this sort of bomb pause and so forth, the North Vietnamese answer was the same. We're not going to talk to you. We're not going to negotiate with you. You would think the Johnson people would have gotten a clue.
Hanoi used any pause as an opportunity to fortify defenses and rebuild. Moscow and Beijing, each vying for leadership of the global communist movement, competed to supply the North. The Soviets sent more than 8,000 military advisors who donned Vietnamese uniforms to disguise their nationality. Soviets supplied radar, anti-aircraft artillery, and surface-to-air missiles proved a deadly counterweight to American air power. With more than 250 interceptor aircraft, 8,000 anti-aircraft guns, and 25 surface-to-air missile battalions, North Vietnam had one of the best air defense networks in the world. For their part, the Chinese trained North Vietnamese pilots, built railways and bridges, and provided more than 300,000 support personnel.
There was this fear of escalation. The fact that there were Russian and Chinese troops in the north at the time, I mean, Soviet gunners shooting down our airplanes, that was underreported. It didn't seem like Moscow had any issues with killing Americans. It's strange that we were so cautious about wanting to take out Soviets who were there in secret, and Moscow probably wouldn't even have admitted that they were there.
Johnson's escalation demanded not only air power, but boots on the ground. In July of 1965, he ordered an increase in U.S. military forces in Vietnam from 75,000 to 125,000, and he doubled the number of Americans called up for the draft. Almost 500,000 U.S. soldiers would be in country by the end of 1967. the American death toll would reach 11,363.
As President Johnson has said, upon our strength and upon our wisdom rests the future. The United States does have and will continue to have a commanding superiority of arms.
The war would come to consume the Johnson presidency, but it also put enormous pressure on the leadership in Hanoi.
Another of the myths of Vietnam is that the North Vietnamese were infinitely patient and they would do whatever and just wait us out. And it turns out now that we know more about their internal thinking, by 1967, they have become very impatient because things are going very badly for them. They're taking crippling losses from the Americans. So they decide something's got to change.
To put things in context, North Vietnam was losing the war. They knew it. It's been documented by a number of their people, and they thought that if they could launch a general offensive and uprising, perhaps the people of South Vietnam would rise up, or something would happen that would change things. Perhaps it would affect public opinion in the United States, which was a key target from the beginning.
I believe the war in Vietnam is illegal, immoral, politically unjustifiable, and economically motivated. Could either of you agree with this?
Who wants to start? In a debate between Robert F. Kennedy and then Governor of California Ronald Reagan, the two men disagreed on the effect protests at home had on the war itself.
I don't think a particular action takes place, military action takes place in South Vietnam because of the protests here in the United States. I think that even if all the protests were ended and even if all of the objections to the war came to an end here in this country, that the war in Vietnam would continue. I'm sure to some extent the fact that there are some protests gives some encouragement to Ho Chi Minh and to others, but I certainly don't think that that's the reason that the war is continuing and why the casualties are going up.
Well, I definitely think that the demonstrations are prolonging the war in that they're giving the enemy, who I believe must face defeat on relative comparison of the power of the two nations. They're giving him encouragement to continue to hold out on the hope that division here in America will bring about a peace without defeat for that enemy. We, I think, are faced with a choice here. But again, and I'm sure the Senator agrees with me, America will jealously guard this right of dissent, because I think the greatness of our country has been based on our thinking that everyone has a right even to be wrong.
Reagan clearly saw the Vietnam War in a global context, and in words that would be echoed decades later, previewed an event that would become a major part of his own presidential legacy.
I think it would be very admirable if the Berlin Wall, which was built in direct contravention to a treaty, if the Berlin Wall should disappear. I think this would be a step toward peace and toward self-determination for all peoples if it were. We don't want the Berlin Wall knocked down so it's easier to get at the throats of the East Germans. We just think that a wall that is put up to confine people and keep them within their own country instead of allowing them the freedom of world travel has to be somehow wrong.
A bloody battle rages in the center of Saigon.
On January 31st, Hanoi put its plan into motion. Just after midnight, the North Vietnamese launched a surprise attack against nearly every provincial capital and major city in South Vietnam. It became known as the Tet Offensive, named after the Vietnamese Lunar New Year. It marked a turning point in the war.
Once again, the plight of the civilian is heartrending.
The North Vietnamese employed tanks, troop carriers, and all the trappings of a regular army.
By fighting a conventional type conflict, it actually worked to our strengths, because this is the kind of war that we're really good at. The United States can't always cope with counterinsurgency, but we're great at conventional war, and that's what they found out.
85,000 North Vietnamese troops participated in the offensive. They briefly held portions of 36 of the country's 44 provincial capitals, including Saigon, where they breached the outer walls of the U.S. Embassy. But South Vietnamese troops and American firepower proved surprisingly resilient. As one American observer put it, finally, This is the war we came here to fight.
Everywhere they attacked, they were driven back, with one exception. They held on to the imperial capital of Hue, which was a beautiful city with all sorts of historic buildings, because the South Vietnamese and the Americans did not want to use artillery or air power. So we sent Marines in there to clear the city block by block, and a lot of people died in the process. Ultimately, we did use artillery and air power, but other than holding Hue for close to a month, the communists didn't hold any position for more than 3 days. When it was over, they had suffered well over 10 fatalities for everyone they inflicted upon the U.S. or the South Vietnamese. It was a devastating defeat for them.
Conservative estimates put the North's losses at 40,000 killed and 7,000 captured. The Viet Cong, forced for the first time to fight out in the open, suffered the worst casualties and never really recovered.
After the Tet Offensive, the South Vietnamese Viet Cong were no longer an effective fighting force, and they write this in their own histories. The casualty level was immense, and it allowed the North Vietnamese to take over the war totally, including politically.
The largest battle of the war had ended in total defeat for Hanoi. But the attack on the U.S. Embassy, itself a failure that resulted in the death or capture of all the Viet Cong involved in the operation, provided irresistible pictures and a completely different narrative presented by the U.S. media.
The attack on the U.S. Embassy during Tet got the most coverage of anything during Tet, and it wasn't even part of the original North Vietnamese plan. It was just like this pickup attack by some guys that they had assembled right before the offensive was supposed to kick off. But it was spun as this great victory for them because the press cast it as it was just a symbolic attack, that they weren't even supposed to seize the embassy, according to the media. Well, yes, they were. They were supposed to seize the embassy and win, but they didn't.
In reality, they never came close. They didn't get inside the American embassy. What they did, a sapper squad used an RPG, a rocket-propelled grenade, to blow a hole in the outer wall to the embassy. A handful of sappers went through and with two exceptions, were killed on the spot. 2 survived overnight and were killed the next morning.
A Harris poll conducted in the first week of February showed that 61% of Americans agreed with the statement, "The successful Viet Cong penetration of the United States Embassy compound shows that we were not prepared for the attack." But other polls indicated that support for bombing the North improved, with 69% saying they wanted the air campaign to continue.
When you get to the end of 1968, one thing people generally don't know is there's actually more support for the war at that time than there is in 1965. So there's a strong element of American society that is willing to stick with us, which is one of the, I think, most important parts of Vietnam that gets overlooked. It's not the case that everybody gets disillusioned quickly and decides this is a terrible mistake. There are people who think that way, but there's also a lot who believe that communism is an existential threat, that we have great national interest here, and that also for the United States, it's not a good thing to go send 500,000 troops to fight for a few years and then go home and abandon your allies.
But the media, especially television news, had begun to turn against the war.
Hardly a day has passed in this war without the death or wounding of innocent civilians. But up until now, this has been mainly in the countryside. Now the Viet Cong have carried the war into the cities, and there seems to be no place to hide from the bombs and the bullets.
On February 27th, CBS television aired an hour-long special, a report from Vietnam, hosted by Walter Cronkite. Cronkite said that Tet had proved that the war would no longer be a guerrilla struggle, but one featuring, in his words, large armies locked in combat, moving towards decisions on the battlefield. He concluded his report by saying,
"For it seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate."
Walter Cronkite, at the beginning of, the war and our involvement in it, was a proponent of it. And then 1968, he editorialized on television and said we couldn't win. So there was this sense of defeat, and you had this segment of America that was no longer being listened to. You had the hard hats who were protesting against the protesters. You had middle America that in surveys was saying they supported our increased efforts in Vietnam. And a lot of that had to do with lies about what kind of government we were trying to prevent from emerging in Vietnam. Lies about, this is what the people want. The Vietnamese people want communism, and we are denying them that freedom.
The political defeat from Tet, a lot of people have been blamed for this, the media, anti-war activists, but it really lands on Lyndon Johnson's shoulders. He was the leader at the time. He was handed this magnificent military victory, but the North Vietnamese came nowhere near what they were trying to do with Tet. I mean, measured against their aspirations. I mean, they were supposed to take over the whole country. They didn't take over anything. In fact, their forces were destroyed. And Johnson was handed this victory, and his generals said, now's the time to exploit this. Let's finish the job. And Johnson said no.
After the Tet Offensive, what we could have done to end the war was to block Haiphong Harbor, as we did later in 1972, which basically shut down the North Vietnamese supply line that they desperately needed to keep the war in the South going. And also, we could have shut the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was their main supply route and reinforcement route that went from North Vietnam through Laos and Cambodia into South Vietnam. If we had done that, they could not have effectively continued the war.
Johnson faced long odds for re-election. His top aides feared he wouldn't even win the Democratic nomination. Running on an anti-war platform, Senator Eugene McCarthy had come surprisingly close to victory in the New Hampshire primary, winning 42% of the vote to Johnson's 48%. Bolstered by McCarthy's strong showing, Robert F. Kennedy declared that he would join the race to challenge LBJ. Johnson felt forced to make a decision.
With American sons in the field far away, with America's future under challenge right here at home, with our hopes and the world's hopes for peace and the balance every day, I do not believe that I should devote an hour or a day of my time to any personal partisan causes or to any duties other than the awesome duties of this office, the presidency of your country. Accordingly, I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
Lyndon Johnson explained that the reason why he chose not to run again for president was to prove his sincerity to the North Vietnamese, that he really wanted peace with them. The North Vietnamese thought this was a trick, and the Chinese told them, there's no way that a president of the United States is going to give up power just for this. And they thought it was this big scheme of his. So not only did he give up power, but he didn't even get the result he wanted.
The real lesson is when you engage in war, you should do that very, very reluctantly. We don't go to war unless we have to defend ourselves or defend an ally. But when you do, entirely consistent with the laws of war, you apply effective, good military advice, and you engage in effective warfighting to win the war. And we failed to do that for many, many years, in part, again, the failure of McNamara and also LBJ.
May 1968 would become the bloodiest single month for Americans in Vietnam, with more than 2,100 U.S. casualties. Lyndon Johnson's vice president, Hubert Humphrey, would run at the top of the Democratic ticket, heading up a party deeply divided over what to do next in Vietnam. In November, Richard Nixon would win the White House, promising to end the war and bring American soldiers home, part of a larger change in American foreign policy with far-reaching consequences. That's next time on the Unauthorized History of the Vietnam War.